All right, now that we understand efficiency and surplus a little bit, let's talk about times when the government steps in and intervenes in the market. So the market has reached an equilibrium price, but the government has decided that they don't think that price is fair. So they can either come in and set a price ceiling, which is the maximum price that sellers can charge, or they can set a price floor, which is the minimum price that sellers can charge. So a price ceiling, they set below the market equilibrium price. Okay, what they're saying is that um, so the ceiling doesn't go high. The ceiling says what they're saying is the market price is too high. We want to set something below that, and so we set a maximum or a ceiling somewhere below the equilibrium price. And so it would look like, so here's demand and here's supply, and the market reaches here, and they said, no, 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 that's too high. We're going to set this price as the maximum you can charge. And so they set a ceiling, but it has to be below the equilibrium price. For a price floor, this is the minimum that sellers can charge for it. This is the minimum it can be sold for. And this is set above the equilibrium price. Again, we say here's where the market arrived, and we said that's too low. These poor sellers can't survive with that. It has to be sold for more than that. So we set a floor above that and said this is the lowest price it can go for. Okay, they're not super common. Most of the time we let the market do it, but we see examples of uh, we see examples in minimum wage, we see rent control situations, and we see agricultural price controls are the big one for the price floor. So let's talk about what happens, because we know if we have a price that is not the equilibrium price, which is what we're saying in this case, then the market's not going to be efficient. We're going to move surplus from one group to another, and we're going to have deadweight loss. That's always going to be the case. So in this case, this is a price floor, and so this is in the wheat market. There are loads of agricultural price supports in the United States. So this is actually kind of common. So we said, okay, if we don't do anything, the price of wheat would be $6.50. So this area, if we were at equilibrium, this area right here between the demand curve and the price would be consumer surplus, and from the price down the supply curve would be the producer surplus. Okay, so this whole area up here would be consumer, and this whole area down here would be producer. But we've said that 650 price isn't fair. Farmers can't survive on that. So we said the minimum price that wheat can sell for is $8. We set a price floor at $8. So that means we're going to cut it off right here, okay? At a price of $8, the quantity demanded is 1.8 million. And the quantity supplied would be up here somewhere, and so we would have a surplus, okay? We're always going to have that. So here's where I set my price floor. So what I have now, the area between the demand curve and the new price, that's my consumer surplus. That's it. The producer surplus is the price down to the supply curve, but I'm only going to sell 1.8 million, so they don't get the whole thing there. They just get this area. So this is the producer surplus, and B and C is dead weight loss because nobody buys those. Okay, um, so so this is kind of a complicated situation. So for number one, how do you force that price up there? Because now these producers at a price of $8, they produce this many. Let's say it's 2.2 billion bushels, but they're only selling 1.8 billion. So what's going to happen there? So now they're going to have this surplus. So either the government has to come in and buy the surplus, but then what's the government going to do with the wheat? If they give it away, they have to give it to somebody who would not have been purchasing it, because then that would take away from this 1.8 that they sell here. So they'd have to take it and give to somebody. The other way they do it is they kind of they because now you got this problem. What are you going to do with this surplus? Because if the farmers don't produce as much, if they supply less, if you pay, I don't know if you've heard this, but they pay farmers not to farm. They're like, we're going to pay you what you would have paid in order to just let your farm sit empty. So, and it's not for all crops, but so if supply goes back, if I pay you not to supply, then that again brings the price up. Their goal is to keep this 8, but they want the price to stay at 8. But the market is naturally going to be trying to force its way back down to 6.50. So they have to either pay people not to farm, which would bring the supply back, or they have to purchase this excess over here. Either way, so that if the government is paying farmers not to farm, or if the government is buying the surplus, the government's paying, which means the taxpayers are paying. So number one, as consumers, you're paying a higher price over here. Number two, you're paying more in taxes to support these. So it's almost like you're paying it twice. So, and you know, it's a even more complicated issue than that, because you've got this situation. Okay, so like here's all the wheat farmers, all right, and so they're benefiting by this, right? That A. The thing is, something like wheat, a crop like wheat, is almost all of it is coming from these huge factory farms in the Midwest, and I mean they are huge. They are billion-dollar businesses, and so most of this benefit is going to these huge farms in the Midwest, and those guys are already really, really rich. I mean, really rich. And so we're making them richer. Is that wrong? Yes, it's wrong. But let's say here's the wheat farmers. 90% of those wheat farmers are these big guys that are already rich, okay? And then 10% are these little farmers, okay? And so most of this benefit, let's just say A is this whole benefit to the farmers for this. Most of that, 90% of that, is going to these big guys making these rich guys even richer. But 10% of it is going to help these small farmers. And so are we willing to pay taxes and pay higher prices for wheat in order to help these small firms? That is not a question that economics can answer, but that's what we have to look at. So every time we look at this, we're like, what's the benefit? What's the cost? There's always a cost, right? And who are we helping? And is that who we want to help? And so in this case, some people, half the reason these are still in place is probably because these guys have really powerful lobbyists in place, and also because most people don't know that these are in place. But you can say, I know it's not fair that I'm making these rich people richer, but I still think it's worth it to help these 10% here. That becomes more of a normative thing than a positive thing. And so in what we'll generally just say is, okay, here's what it looks like, if we do this, and here's how much benefit there is, here's how much consumers are losing, here's how much farmers are winning, here's which farmers are winning. But then ultimately, somebody has to decide whether that's worth it or not. And that's where there's a lot of, controversy, because not everyone's going to agree with that. So I just wanted to do kind of a before and after. If we were at equilibrium, okay, here, I'll change colors. Here would be the consumer surplus, and then here, I think I did it backwards, but whatever. Here would be the producer surplus, okay? They would be this whole area right here, if we let the market at equilibrium. If we go with this price floor, now here's the new price, here's the supply curve. So here's the producer surplus, this whole area right here. And then the consumer surplus is down to this one. And then just this little area right here. And then here is our deadweight loss. Nobody benefits from that one because they either don't get sold, or like I said, or the government buys them up, and then that brings up it's a whole other problem. So here's if we're at equilibrium. And again, we're not super concerned with point A that got transferred consumers to producers because somebody still benefits, but we are concerned with the deadweight loss. That's a loss of efficiency. And are we willing to accept that loss of efficiency? It goes back to It was chapter 1 or 2 when we talk about equity versus efficiency. And so, are we willing to look at this? Are we willing to sacrifice this efficiency in order to gain some equity here to help these farmers? Okay. An example of a price ceiling is rent control. Okay. Um, so if we were at equilibrium, it would let's see, I'll get it straight this time, and I'll say blue. So the rent would be 2,500 now, and so this area here between the demand curve and the price would be consumer surplus, and this area between the between the price and the supply curve would be producer surplus. Okay. Now, the government has kept in and said that sometimes you see this like in New York City or something, but you see a similar thing with like Section 8 housing where there's a cap on the rent. There's a maximum that they're allowed to charge. And so this is the max we're allowed to charge now. Okay, we said nobody can afford this. 25 or 1,500 is the max you can charge. So here is my price ceiling. Okay, so now what we've got is, we'll erase some of this. Now here is the producer surplus, just this little area here. And then the consumer surplus is this area here. But it's just this part because, again, these apartments will not get sold. So now at this point, here is the quantity demanded. And, oh, sorry, we hit, when we go to 1,500 here, we hit supply first. So this is the quantity supplied, and then we go over and then we hit, this is the quantity demanded. So now I have a shortage of apartments. So the people that were able to get apartments for the lower price are happy, but now there's 100,000 people who were in the market for an apartment and now can't find one. So the winners are the people who got the apartment for the lower price. The losers are the landlords who lost money and the people who can't get apartments. And so you see, there come out to be some other problems in here as well. For instance, okay, there's this huge shortage of apartments, and if you watch like Friends or anything that's takes place in New York, you see this a lot because there's rent-controlled neighborhoods, and people go through these crazy things to try to get an apartment when one becomes available. So the cost of looking for apartment, which is time, comes available. You've got situations where this is the legal amount that they could charge, but then you could pay under the table and it still brings the price up, and sometimes that'll end up bringing the price up even more. Like it will go all the way up here to 3,000. You would pay 1,500 legally, pay the other 1,500 under, so because you would follow this up to the demand curve, you'd pay the other. So you end up paying more than you were before to get one. If it's like a rent control situation, they've got a list. If you're complaining because you don't like the way the water's leaking, forget it. Then I can just get somebody else. I got a line of people waiting. So there's no incentive for these producers to invest in the property to keep it nice. If it's competitive, they have to have a nice apartment in order to attract renters. But if there's a shortage and you've got all these people just waiting for one, there's no incentive for them to do that. So it's in here to create equity, but these situations cause more problems than they solve. Or you solve one problem and you cause three more. So they're really very complicated. They're very complicated issues. If you're one of the winners, if you're one of these people that got this apartment, you're happy. If you're one of these other people, either producers or the people who couldn't get it or the people that are having to pay under the table or whatever, then you don't think this is a great idea. So I mean, both cases are true. It just depends which side of the fence you're on. So again, if we look at it here, this was before. So just kind of ignore these things. Before we were like this, and so here was the consumer surplus, and here the price to the supply curve is the producer. Once we put the rent control in, here at 15, here's my ceiling. This area right here is the producer. The area between the new price and the supply curve that's producer surplus. The area between the price and the demand curve is the consumer surplus. But again, there's only 1,900 apartments available, so this area right here is dead weight loss. So just talking a little bit about kind of the problems that arise with this. The shortage of apartments can lead to a black market, again, where people end up paying over the black market price. And again, what this means is, here, I'll go back to, oops, this one, it's a little easier to see. If you take, here's the price, and you follow that up to the demand curve, this would be the black market price. So it's even more than you were paying before this action. So stop that. So that creates a problem. Landlords, might just make apartments not available. So I used to have an apartment, but now I just do it to be like an Airbnb in order to avoid rent control, because I can charge a higher price for it that way. So it makes something available, but then, you don't have the legal protection, you don't have a lease, you don't have all these kinds of things. And so it's not a great, it's not really a great situation. So when we have government price controls, either a price ceiling or a price floor, some people are going to be better off, some people are going to be worse off. There's always going to be dead weight loss. There's always going to be a loss of efficiency. There's always going to be somebody, and generally what we have is more people losing than winning. And so that's what we mean by the dead weight loss. And that's always going to be the case. You're always going to have a shortage or surplus. And we have the same thing with, minimum wage is a price floor. And so I have a little extra thing posted in D2L to kind of look at that and the impacts. And so if we go, oops, where'd you go? If we go, sorry, I went too far. A price ceiling is, a minimum wage is a price floor. It works like this, okay? Like this one. And so, excuse me. So if we say the equilibrium, if we didn't interfere, would be $6.50, and the government says, oh, nobody can live on that. I'm going to set it to 15. So we go here, okay? Well, now this is the market for workers, essentially, okay? So the supply is the workers, and the demand are the employers, okay? So now here's the quantity demanded, here's the quantity supplied. You have a great big surplus of workers. That's unemployment. So the farther you set minimum wage away from what the actual is, the more unemployment you're gonna create. And it creates unemployment in, the very the low income, the low skilled workers is where it's going to hit. So when we talk about what we should set minimum wage at, it really depends and we've had a minimum wage for so long, it's hard to say what the real equilibrium is. If you set it at 15 and it's really, 12, you might not see that big of a difference. But that's the thing you have to be aware of. And there's a lot of talk right now about the $15 minimum wage, but there are going to be costs. And so there's some extra stuff posted so you can kind of look at that, because that's important to know. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about briefly was taxes. Okay, so taxes are important. That's how government funds all their activities. If you want the government to do stuff, we got to pay taxes. That's another thing. If you look at some of these countries that do have a $15 minimum wage, they also pay a lot higher taxes than we do. So it's kind of a different model. It doesn't say one's right or one's wrong, but it's different. So how much is the right amount of tax to charge? So there's this thing called a Laffer curve, okay? And so it looks like this. Here's the tax rate, okay? 0 or 100%, and here's maybe 50%. And then here's the government's income, okay? So the Laffer curve said, okay, if you charge 0% taxes, the government won't collect any money. If the government charge 100% taxes, they also won't make any money because nobody's going to work if the government's going to take it all. Okay, so there's some magical point in between here. Okay, um, so if this is, let's say this is 25%. I don't know. If you're charging 20%, that means you could be charging more and increase your income. But if you go past that point, and let's say you start taxing people at 35%, then people start working less, okay? And so you're charging a higher rate, but if people are working less, you're collecting less income. So the government would like to know what this magic number is here to charge. And, people don't agree with it, but they have to do it. If you charge too much, people just stop working. Especially if you're used to paying less and now you pay more. Have you ever been in a situation where you work overtime and all of a sudden you bring home less because it popped you up in the next tax bracket? And so you worked more but actually paid less. So if that's the situation, then you're not going to want to work overtime, right? You're not going to want to work more. And so you would come back over to here then. But tax incident is actually who pays the tax, the buyer or the seller. That's not the legal obligation. But the way it works, and it has to do with elasticity, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. But just to, so let's say it's cigarettes, okay? The legal obligation to pay the taxes on the cigarette producer, but they just pass that on to the consumers in the form of higher prices. So even though they had the legal obligation, they just charge the consumers more, they collect more, and then pass it on. So the tax incident is actually going to the smoker, okay? So what determines when that happens and when that doesn't? So it has to do with the slope of the curves. And when we did chapter 3, we did pretty much like a 45-degree angle for all of our supply and demand, but they're not really like that, which is what we get into in the next chapter. So a steep demand curve, okay, looks like this, all right? And so let's say you're charging, I don't know, $10 and you sell 100. If the price goes up to 11, the quantity demanded will go down, but only by a little bit. If you have a flat demand curve, where it looks like this, okay, and you're charging 10 and selling 100, and you price it to 11, and I'm going to try and keep this about the same, you see you have a much bigger decrease in the quantity demanded than you had here. Same change in price, and you could draw this on a graph and get the same. But see, this went down to, I don't know, 95, and then this went down to 75. So much bigger change on your x-axis because of the flatter curve. And that has to do with how sensitive people are. So for instance, if the firm got charged a tax here and it was very little change, like cigarettes, then they would just pass that on because they know that even if they increase their price, it's hardly going to impact their sales at all. But if it's something that people are very sensitive to a change in price, if I increase my price even a little bit, I'm going to see a big drop in sales, so I'm not going to do it, and I, the firm, am going to eat that tax. That's what we mean by tax incidence. And then the same thing would apply for sellers as well. So that's kind of the government getting involved in prices, either through price floors, price ceilings, or through taxes.